Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. Thank you to Susa for organizing this series of lectures. This is the third and last one of this short series within
Thank you for reminding that.
Institute of Mediterranean Oriental Cultures Archaeological Seminars. So this is a, let's say, a regular event, but these three presentations were connected and they were related to the Near East and the Nile Valley. So this is the last one, and I'm going to talk about the rock art of the Nile First Cataract region in Egypt in a supra-regional perspective. So rock art in northeastern Africa is quite common, particularly in Egypt. But as you can see from this map that I put on the slide here, so mentioning the Saharan rock art and North African rock art, it is not well known outside of Egypt, so outside of Egyptology. It's still very much a work in process. And as a matter of fact, it's also a work in process within Egyptology, because it's, let's say, a part of the ancient Egyptian heritage that is less known and less used in understanding and developing our understanding of ancient Egypt. Most of what we know nowadays is based on the work of the late Dirk Huygens and also of John Darnell and Sten Hendricks. So these are, let's say, the three major figures that in the last decades have consistently worked on ancient Egyptian rock art, particularly pre-dynastic rock art and its connection, let's say, with the state formation period, the iconography of the pre-dynastic, early dynastic period. But there are a new, let's say, group of young generation peoples that are finally specializing on this topic. And I want to remember here just two of them, Doriane van Hoel from Belgium and Axel Bremont, that is also with us. She's currently at the IFAO in Egypt. So there are new people that are also new Egyptologists who are specializing on this specific data set. I'm working in Aswan, in the Aswan region, so it's a crossroads, a very famous one along the Nile, centrally positioned, let's say, which connects different places, not only north-south, but also east-west, so across the deserts. Is an area that is very rocky, is characterized by the presence of the Nile cataracts, so outcrops, granitic outcrops that stop the river flow. The desert is very close to the river, so there is not much, let's say, valley, available land. So the desert landscape is very much part of this environment. The area has been extremely changed in modern times by the construction of two dams south of the cataract, and we actually have lost lower Nubia to the Lake Nasser. And also north of the cataract, there are a lot of quarrying activities going on, construction, urban development, agricultural development. So there are a lot of damages that are affecting also the rock art. So I was mentioning that I've been working there since 2005 as director of the Aswan-Kom Ombo Archaeological Project, which is a large international enterprise with a quite complex, let's say, fieldwork program. So we do different things. And one of these, let's say, line of research is the documentation of rock art. The region is very rich on rock art, and all the red dots that you can see here, thanks to the work by Serena Nicolini, who is a PhD student of mine at University of Bologna. So you can see also the spatial distribution of what we know so far as rock art sites. I'm not mentioning rock art inscriptions, the rock inscriptions that are also quite common in the area. So these are just rock art sites. And as you can see, those in the orange circles are those who are under the investigation of my project. So it's at least half of the rock art in the region is what we are dealing with. We have a large team working on rock art because we don't just do rock art study, but we also try to put the rock art into a wider context, not just cultural, but also geoarchaeological. So the landscape is very important too. And we use a lot of digital documentation. And I want to thank you. I'm not going to tell you, to read you all the people who are part of our team. I just want to thank and acknowledge the work by our Bisharin collaborators, so the desert nomads, who have been really, really helpful, particularly in documenting and finding the rock art in the desert. We started to use digital documentation for the rock art since 2010, much earlier than anybody else in Egypt, in Upper Egypt. And before then, the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquity required only digital documentation to be applied. So the old, let's say, traditional way of copying manually on the surface, the drawings is not allowed any longer in Egypt. We don't just document the rock art, but also the landscape. So we try also to reconstruct digitally the surrounding landscape. We have started a program of community engagement and community awareness on rock art, on this kind of ancient Egyptian heritage, which is, as I said, particularly in danger. So the rock art in the First Cataract region is very old and really spans from the late Paleolithic up to modern times. So you can see here some examples of late Paleolithic rock art, particularly the aurochs were a common feature. The geometric pattern of the Epipaleolithic art, and then the pre-dynastic the rock art that is very, very, very common and very rich in the area. Dynastic, pharaonic related rock art, but also Nubian related rock art. And then there is also later times with, camels. And as a matter of fact, we have also modern contemporary rock art because we have drawings with an airplane or a motorcycle. So that's clearly, pretty recent. So from, more than 20,000 years, people in this area were drawing some rocks. The context. So for us, it's a very important point to reconstruct the context, the natural context, let's say the natural and cultural context of these drawings. And let's see, for instance, that some of them were drawn on rocks present in natural landmarks, both along the Nile, but also in the major wadis. So you can see one here. This site here along the wadi, along the Nile, was full of rock art and, of course, also of rock inscriptions of different periods. So clearly, it's a landmark that was visible when, crossing the area from the river. Other rock art has been found in quarry areas. Most of these quarries are of later times, Ptolemaic, Roman, or even pharaonic periods. So not earlier, of course. And these are quarry marks of different types, different kinds, also some inscriptions. Then there are sites like these two that I'm highlighting here, who have been found in hidden places. So these are not, landmarks where people could, pass by, but specific special places. So let's start with the one on the east bank in the area of Khor Abu Zubeira South. This is a small wadi south of the main Wadi Abu Zubeira. It's a very rocky area, full of rock art. There are quite a lot. The landscape is marked by two poles, natural pools, where the water was present after raining. So these were perfect places, perfect location for hunting. And all the rock art is basically dated from Nagada 1 to Nagada 3, so the 4th millennium before Christ. But there are evidence also of later periods. We have, let's say, tentatively dated them to the Badarian period, so 5th millennium, but it's probably, it's more likely that they are even earlier. Anyway, 4th millennium, so it's contemporary with the pre-dynastic period. Many of these representations are representing hunting scenes of wild animals, desert animals, but there are also a lot of boats represented and human figures and so on. These hunting scenes are an iconographic element typical of the pre-dynastic period and apparently was a symbolic ritual event connected with the elites. So it was not, regular hunting for economic purposes. Boats are also have a symbolic meaning. They are connected also with the solar cycle in ancient Egypt iconography and ideology. So these are this kind of rock art is not just, let's say, representing objects or animals, but this is highly symbolic and ideological. One particular representation here at this site, dated to Nagada 2 CD, so more or less the mid of the 4th millennium, represent a boat with a cabin, and on top of the cabin there is a falcon. So this bird that we well known in Egyptology, because in ancient Egypt the falcon was the representation of the god Horus, but it was also associated to the king, particularly at the beginning of the dynastic period. So the names of the king had always a falcon on top of them. And so the presence of a falcon here on top of a boat in a context, a symbolic context like this one, tells you how much this kind of rock art representations were connected with the elite, and in this case, probably with the royalty, so with the royal power. And the other site on the West Bank, Nag el-Amdullab, is also a very complex, large site with different rock art locales spread, let's say, in the landscape, with a lot of representation of boats, archers, enemies, different kind of representations. And if you put all of them together, you can see that they are part of specific, let's say, ritual events that we know are part of the so-called royal jubilee in dynastic times. And as a matter of fact, we have more than one representation of a person, a human figure, with wearing this triangular hat. There is actually a prototype, let's say, of the white crown of ancient Egypt. So this is a king, is a pharaoh, and there is more than one example in this place. Also a human figure with a bow in his hand, and the bow at that time was the representation, the sign, the symbol of Lower Nubia, so probably an elite person connected, with elite, but from Nubia, associated to this royal context. The main scene at the site is this one. As you can see, nowadays completely destroyed, but thanks God we have old pictures from the 60s made by Labib Abashi, that was a famous Egyptologist of that time. So we can see how the panel was, and you can see again the king wearing the white crown at the center of the scene with a parade of royal boats. So we are again in a context of royal official ideological representation. And there is also a small inscription in hieroglyphic, one of the earliest we know, and the inscriptions mention the arrival of the following of Horus in a place called the Panther's Skin, so probably this area. So now we know that the following of Horus means the royal court, Horus meaning the king. So the date that we can give to this rock art cycle is the end of Dynasty 0, beginning of First Dynasty. Probably the king is Narmer himself, the king that unified Egypt. But anyway, what is interesting here is that this kind of rock art has nothing to do with the local communities or just, you know, let's say regular symbolism of the ancient Egyptian culture. These are specific places where the royal agency is marking the landscape in a moment of the end of the state formation period, so the unification of Egypt. And we know that this area became the southern border with Nubia at that time. So it's a highly charged place, now also from a royal propaganda point of view. We are doing actually a virtual restoration of this panel. So you can see the old picture. We have used it and put it on top of a 3D reconstruction of the actual, let's say, wall surface. And we were able to reconstruct virtually part of the ancient panel, the ancient scene. So this is something that we can do with this new digital documentation technologies. Other sites, other rock art sites are along possible inland paths. We have to remember that during summertime in ancient periods, not nowadays, the Nile was flooding the valley around it. And so in this area where the valley is very narrow, of course, was not so possible to cross, let's say, go north-south following the river. So the inland paths were also very common in use. And apparently there is some rock art panels, rock art stations, were marking this kind of pathways. And so we can see them here on the West Bank. In one case here to the north, the uppermost one that we know so far, we have a few blocks all depicted with different representation. One here is quite interesting because we have two human figures on a boat, and one of these has again this triangular hat on top of his head, and also this other guy here has, you know, too many royal related paraphernalia, and so again you can see that there is, you know, this kind of royal agency pretty common in the area, so very much present in the area. Another site of these inland sites, again from the same, more or less the same period, a little bit later, is in a stone wall, let's say stone platform here on the below this rock. And in this case, along with the common, let's say, pre-dynastic iconography with, you know, wild animals, hunting scenes and boats, we have also cattle, so bovids, who are pretty common in the Nubian tradition of rock art and the Nubian culture in general. So there is this mix that is quite peculiar of the First Cataract region. You don't find it very commonly farther north. So we have seen what kind of sites we have along the Nile, and many of them are actually dated to the pre-dynastic, early dynastic period, but there are also sites very far into the desert. We have found one in particular in the Eastern Desert, about 50 kilometers from the river, and is a long and narrow and rocky wadi packed of rock art. Is one of the southernmost known in Egypt and one of the richest known in Egypt. It's really full of rock art, some of which could be dated to the late Paleolithic, like in this case. We are still working on the interpretation and also on the dating as far as we can. But there are, you know, chances that some of these drawings are Paleolithic in date. We have evidence of Epipaleolithic, so early Holocene rock art. We have a rich repertoire of pre-dynastic, early dynastic rock art with huge panels, very complex superimpositions. But we have also a lot of later period Nubian rock art. Later period means from the 4th to 3rd millennium on, and representing cows. Like in this one, you see this is a huge one covering. It's basically natural 1-by-1 site, so it's really big. There are evidence of rock art that is pretty much what you can find along the Nile, boats, for instance, of the same types that you can find in other places, in Egypt and also in the eastern desert of Egypt. There are many human figures, again, similar to what you can find in other places in Egypt, but also different ones. Like this one here, for instance, is quite uncommon. I just want to show you the big feet of this guy here, who are quite unique. Never found something like this. There are also rows of human figures doing different kind of activities, ritualistic activities of some kind. In this case, for instance, there is a row of male figures and 2 female figures in the front. So quite unique again. These are a common, let's say, representation for the pre-dynastic period, particularly well known in dynastic pottery, pre-dynastic pottery, but quite unique in rock art. But then you have also scenes like this one with a herd of elephants, which is quite unique. So you can find elephants depicted in pre-dynastic, early dynastic rock art, but not in this way. So things that we have in the desert are pretty different from what we have along the Nile in this area. Also, this huge ostrich with, you know, with the open feather, it's unique. So there are many diversities, although there are many similarities between the 2 rock art, let's say, repertoires of the desert and the Nile Valley. Another case, for instance, in this panel with a lot of cows and human figures. And if you look at the human figures, you would say, oh, these are very similar to what you can find in pre-dynastic Nagada 1 painted pottery. But then the cows don't match that kind of iconography, and definitely you don't have this kind of large herds with, you know, a lot of animals and people put together. So some unique iconography, some variability that is very interesting, let's say, to mention. The site, it's called Wadi Ras Ras, this site in the desert, is full of cows. There are many, many of them in different ways and different contexts. We have also later evidence of zebu, for instance. They are pretty uncommon in this part of Africa. They are more common in the Horn of Africa, and also of camel, as I said. So really, the evidence of use of this kind of artistic use of the area prolonged through the millennia. One particular panel found here on this small overhang is painted. So this is quite a unique occurrence in Egypt, but is known, painted rock art is known farther south in Nubia, also in the Sahara. In this case, we have cows, again, cattle of different kind, and similar to the Nubian tradition, on top of earlier depiction. Quite common here too are the so-called wusum, or marks. These are cattle or tribal marks that you can find in this wadi everywhere. But the closer you go to the Nile, the less you find, and then they tend to disappear along the river. These are instead quite common from, let's say, the late Roman period up to modern times. And we know that, for instance, one of the king of the Blemmyes was using this kind of marks as a signature. And they are still in use by modern tribes as their marks. Now, if we go a little bit farther than the First Cataract region, as I said, is a crossroads of people and ideas, and it was also the ancient border between Egypt and Nubia. We can see that this kind of rock art has many connections, of course, with the Upper Egyptian rock art and the Egyptian Eastern Desert rock art. Of course, this is the closest, let's say, connection, not only with the typical, let's say, 4th millennium iconographic representation of boats and hunting scenes of different kinds, but also with this royal agency. So this kind of rock art that is directly connected with the state formation. And we can see that we have evidence of the same kind in AKAP, so north of Aswan, but also in Thebes, modern-day Luxor. We have to notice anyway that in the First Cataract we have much more of this kind of evidence. So there is clearly a cluster there. Less evident is the connection with the Western Desert, particularly with the Oasis rock art, but there are possibilities there, particularly for the earliest evidence, for instance, with the giraffes representation that may have links with the Saharan, let's say, sphere of rock art tradition. A strong connection is also present and visible with the Nubian tradition, particularly with the cows, no? With the cattle scenes. We know of comparative, let's say, data from pottery, for instance, dated to the 3rd millennium, but also 3rd, 2nd millennium, but also from the 4th millennium. And we have evidence along the Nile, so in the Nubian Nile area, of the Middle Nile area, but also in the Nubian Eastern Desert or at Bai. And here, for instance, we have a panel that was found by our colleagues from the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology of the Polish Academy of Sciences in the Eastern Desert in Sudan. So this kind of rock art that is clearly a Nubian tradition, Nubian connection, is pretty common in the First Cataract region compared to northern regions. So again, this is quite interesting for us. Boats, we have mentioned the boats as typical occurrence, iconographical elements of the pre-dynastic, early dynastic iconography, but as a matter of fact, they are pretty common also in Nubia, with some variables. Anyway, there are some variants. For instance, this kind of schematic boats dated to the Nagada III period seems to be more common in Nubia than in Egypt, and they are pretty common also in the First Cataract. So there may be here another Nubian connection, in this case with, let's say, the contemporary A group culture that is a complex polity and that developed contemporary to the state formation period in Egypt. If we go a little bit further, well, we can see there too there are connections, and these are pretty interesting to us. And here I just want to mention two of them. One of them is the one here below, is the earliest one, so it's dated to the first half, let's say, of the 4th millennium, and is connected with this kind of boats representation. These are from Korab Subeira South, so one of the wadis that we have seen on the east bank, close to the Nile River. And in this case, we found boats, so this kind of representation of boats, they are quite characteristic of our area, and they're apparently pretty unknown elsewhere in Upper Egypt or the Egyptian Eastern Desert. But our colleague Julian Cooper has found similar representations here in this area of the Etbai, so the Nubian Eastern Desert. So again, there may be a connection with the southern part of the Nile, with the southern part of the desert. Another type of boat instead that is similar to the one that I show you with the falcon on top of it, and is dated to Nagada II or early Nagada III, so mid second half of the 4th millennium BCE, are common in Upper Egypt, the Egyptian Eastern Desert, but one example has been found as far as the Arabian Peninsula. And this really opens, for us, the study of the, let's say, ancient Egyptian rock art, because the Red Sea connection, so the connection across the Red Sea between the Arabian Peninsula and Northeastern Africa, of course, are well known, but not in this kind of, let's say, context, not on the rock art. So was never really developed, this kind of line of research, and instead it should be developed and taken into consideration. First of all, we have the Wusum that we have already mentioned, and we have quite a lot here. So again, Julian Cooper has put together what we have in Wadi Ras Ras, and you can see there are quite a number. And these are common occurrences in the Arabian Peninsula, because these kind of signs are directly connected with the ancient Arabian script. So there is a direct connection. These, of course, are from later periods, even modern periods, modern times, but clearly there is a direct connection, let's say, between the two sides of the Red Sea. But as you can see here, I put just together 3 different panels of rock art from Saudi Arabia, from the Arabian Peninsula, and you can see that this scene with the cows is pretty much, what you could get in Nubia or in our region. So again, there may be scope for further investigation. Also, this kind of representation with, for instance, this kind of animal here is very much similar to what you can see in other contexts. Let's see, I have one from Wadi Ras Ras that you can see. Yeah, here you see the same. Here is with only 2 legs. Probably they didn't finish the animal, so we are missing the frontal legs. But let's say clearly the animal is the same, and yeah, you see here. And also the desert animals like ibexes or oryx, these were commonly found, also this kind of dogs were commonly found on both sides of the Red Sea. So in both sides of the desert, from both sides of the Red Sea. So again, there are some iconographic connections. There are natural elements, ecological elements that are shared by the 2 regions. And we know perfectly well that there were nomads crossing the two regions and crossing also the Red Sea. So this kind of evidence should be more, let's say, developed and studied more in details. So I want to thank you very much, and remember that we have a website, my project, the Aswan-Kom Ombo Archaeological Project. So if you want to follow better our research, you can check our website or also social media pages. And I want to remember that not only we have a large team working with us, but also different institutions and founding entities who are supporting our field work. And so I want to thank all of them. And of course, if you have questions, I'm here to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was really very insightful, and I'm especially happy that you mentioned rock art on the other side of the Red Sea, other side from your perspective, because this is what I was precisely thinking of. I don't know how new are the ideas of comparing the rock art from Saudi Arabia with what you have in southern Egypt and in Sudan. It also came to my mind, maybe I'm wrong in that especially looking at multiple cattle representations, that there is something going on similar with the ritual sites in recently discussed sites from Saudi Arabia, where there are ritual sites with thousands of cattle bones. So that's not a rock art, but still a ritual context, and yeah, probably something in common. So is it possible to say already now how close are the connections between those two areas?
But we have archaeological evidence since the early Holocene of connection between the Arabian Peninsula and, I mean, even earlier, of course, the out of Africa also goes from, you know, from the Horn or the Nile Valley into the Arabian Peninsula. But even in later times, so from the early Holocene, we have evidence of crossing the region. And one of the major evidence, for instance, is the arrival of domesticated animals and grains from the Near East, from the Levant, into Northeastern Africa. And one of the earliest evidence of sheep, domesticated animals, sheep in this, sheep goat in this case, is from one of the caves in the Egyptian Eastern Desert, let's say at the latitude of Luxor, modern day Luxor, so farther south. So clearly there is evidence of connection, of crossing the desert, the two sides, probably crossing from, let's say, the Sinai Peninsula in earlier periods, and then by boat or by sea. And this is one of the major evidence in prehistoric times. Rock art can be really one of these evidence, but it's never been taken into consideration properly in this case. So we know that there are nomads that are still living in the region, in the Eastern Desert, so in Egypt and Sudan. And for sure there were nomads also in earlier times. I want to remember that the type of Neolithic that develops in the Nile Valley is a mobile pastoral Neolithic mainly, particularly in the area, the desert area surrounding the Nile Valley. So the agricultural, let's say, development is a later development, particularly in the Egyptian Nile Valley. And this part, let's say, of the state formation process, this kind of agricultural trend. But the surrounding areas were used by mobile groups, and these were clearly moving, and we have evidence also in the archaeological record of many shells from the Red Sea that were used as beads in this context since the Neolithic times and so on. So these populations that were crossing the desert, but they had many things in common also with the same kind of nomadic populations on the other side of the Red Sea, could have been the link between, let's say, the two areas, the two regions. The environment is very much similar. So of course this helped too, because the kind of let's say, connection between man and environment and the kind, let's say, of way of reacting to climatic changes or the landscape, the rocky and dry landscape can be pretty much the same. So when you say that there are also in Yemen, no, there were one of the wadis in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, there are evidence of rituals connected with the cattle, no, with the domestic cattle, so the so-called cattle cult. There is very common also in the central Sahara, so in the Saharan area. And we have evidence also in our area. So another Paul's group from the University of Warsaw and also the Institute of Archaeology and Ethnology as work in the Egyptian Eastern Desert in a site where stone structure and different kind of stone structures were found. And inside this big stone structure, there were tombs of cows, domestic animals, also sheep, goat, and humans. So this ritual landscape that is very common. So also tumuli are very common in our areas since the 5th millennium. So we need to connect more the two sides. So to include also the rock art in this kind of data sets that we already know and we use. So this kind of connection has not been done properly.
Yeah, but that's very interesting, really very revealing. Okay, we have a question. Please unmute yourself and go on.
Hi, thank you so much. That was an amazing presentation. I have a question about the change in the kind of the corpus of iconography over time and what your opinion is about that. Like, for example, maybe in the earlier corpus you have more animals and then it becomes human-centered and then it, you know, goes on and on. I'm just wondering what your input is on that phenomena.
Thanks. Yeah. Well, it really depends. Well, there is a major shift with the state formation, with the unification, so the dynastic period in Egypt. Before the unification of Egypt, the state formation, rock art is one of the major, let's say, visual, artistic media used by the ancient Egyptians, so the pre-dynastic culture. Is really one way to express their symbolism, their iconography, their connection, yeah, with the royal agency, marking the landscape, and so far, so forth. Later on, things change a little bit because the ancient Egyptian, the pharaonic period, they have other ways to mark the landscape, for instance, with rock inscriptions. So at one point you have the switch towards the use of rock inscriptions to mark the landscape in different ways for different reasons. So the artistic evidence is less used by pharaonic Egypt than the written evidence. So we have much more rock inscription than rock art from the pharaonic times. And this is one of the major shifts. It's still in use by the Nubian groups, the Nubian communities, and the nomadic communities in the desert. So you can see that those cows, this cattle representation that are contemporary to pharaonic times are still pretty common. There are many representations of Nubian soldiers or Egyptian boats. But let's say the complex cycles, like in Nagel Amdullab, for instance, with the Royal Jubilee, the official, let's say, connection with the elite, with central power, is missing during pharaonic times. In later periods, yeah, you have a representation of, you know, camel, a lot of camels. And so it's more connected with the desert roads, the trans-desert, let's say, trade, the connection between, you know, the Red Sea ports and the Nile Valley, so this kind of connection. But the Wusum, the presence of Wusum, that's connected also with the local nomads. We are, you know, when we say they are cattle marks or tribal marks, because these are really the signs, the symbol that they were using to also identify themselves as a community, as a group, and as a and so they're animals. So there is again another shift, no? So a different way to represent with a different meaning. So anytime that the agency, so the people who were making rock art, change the reason, and so it changed the ways it's done, what is represented, what it means. But the fact that they're still marking the landscape and using the landscape in this way is important because it means that they are the landscape is part of their cultural space and symbolic space. And we, as I said, I mean, we have still even modern representation of, you know, motorcycles and airplanes. So they are trying to continue this kind of tradition, which is pretty interesting.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Heidi Koop has a question.
Yes. Do you have human representation that you interpret as dancers?
Well, we have those two. Actually, let me share again my screen. Let me see, because there are some representations that may be interpreted as some kind of, yeah, like in this case. So if you look at this representation, we have this line of people, clearly male, all of them, with some sticks or some kind of, yeah, different kind of sticks, not all of them, but some of them in an end. And there seems to be dancing or doing some sort of dancing. And then you have in front of them two female, clearly female figures, so completely different from them. And they are in a frontal row compared to them. So is this an evidence of a ritual dancing or an activity connected with dancing? That can be a possibility. Then we have also the so-called Nagada 2. These are a female dancer or prayers, so they are praying, no? And but they could also be evidence of female dancing. So again, ritual dancing would have been in a context of highly symbolic and ritual, so not just, you know, everyday, let's say, activities. These are the only really possible evidence. Here too, for instance, you have these rows of people put together. So what are they doing? Are they doing some sort of dancing? It may be. So yeah, these are the only, let's say, possibilities that we can find, which are, some are typical of the desert. We don't have them along the Nile, so this is also interesting. So they can be associated with other groups so the nomadic groups of the desert.
Wonderful, thank you very much.
I see another question to you from Hansa.
Spoke earlier about a repertoire that belongs to the late Paleolithic. And my question, if you have found it with this repertoire, lithic material, for example.
Yeah, the rock art from the late Paleolithic has been studied by the late Dirk Oye. And not only, there is also an association, in the rock art locales, no lithic was found, but nearby there are well-known late Paleolithic settlements, campsites with a lot of animal remains, but also lithic remains. But more important than anything else is that one of these panels has been dated with OSL method. So we have a date of the, let's say, the sand sediment that was partially covering some of these drawings. And the date is something like 16,000 before present. And so this means that the rock art was, at least some of the drawings were older than this date. So they should be older than 16 or 20,000 years ago. So more than the lithic, we have a date. So, and this is the only date known so far. There are many locales with late Paleolithic rock art in the Aswan region, but this is the only one dated so far. And it's one of the earliest evidence of rock art in Africa, particularly in Northern Africa. And so this is really, you know, an important evidence for the entire African continent, so not just for Egypt.
Thank you.
Okay, so that's a good question. And are you finding any artifacts around the rock art sites?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So some of the sites are clearly associated with contemporary, let's say, settlements or cemeteries. So in some cases we have pre-dynastic, late dynastic rock art, and nearby we have a village, a campsite, a village with a cemetery. So we can also see in some cases like Nagel Amdullab, so the site with the pharaoh, no, with the king with the white crown and so on, the royal jubilee ritual scenes. In that case, we have evidence shards here and there of the same period, so pre-dynastic vessels that were left, particularly jars that were left around. We found a bifacial flint knife, again from the same period, left nearby. So there are not many evidence. It's usually difficult to find, you know, also because in most of the sites you have rock art from different periods. So you can find here and there some shards, but in some cases like Nagel Amdullab, we have pottery and also lithic of the same period and also connected with possible, let's say, ritual activities. So in that case, it's really specific and also important because clearly they were doing also something there. So it was not just on the rock, but it was also enacted by the people.
And could you spill the beans? How do you differentiate between different periods? And are there any technological differences between the carvings, incisions? Yeah, that's also a question.
Yeah, that's also a question. Yeah, good question. So as you know, rock art is very difficult to date. Yeah, techniques, of course, can tell you something about chronology, but not always, because, for instance, in our case, in Upper Egypt, we have contemporary use of incision and packing, and sometimes also scratching, and it really depends also from the rock surface available. So in most part of, let's say, up in the Theban region, the Luxon region, the rock available is limestone that is very soft and very difficult to work also for this. So most of the rock art is done by scratching or incising, because that's more, let's say, useful for that kind of rock. In the south where we are, in Nubia, we have sandstone, and so their packing is more common in the same period. So even if you have the same kind of representation, you can have two different techniques also, because the rock available, it's, you know, requiring different ways to approach the drawing. So the technology not always work, the packing or incision, or also paintings, not always work as a chronological evidence. There is, of course, the patina that can be also another source of, another element for chronology, but it's not so simple. I mean, we should do more also analysis on this kind of evidence, which unfortunately is not very easy to do in Egypt, because not any kind of sample can be exported out of Egypt, and there are no labs in Egypt to do that properly. So we cannot do things that in other places like the Central Sahara are common, scientific occurrence. So we are mainly relying on overlapping, so different moments, and that can be useful for the chronology. But one good source of comparative data comes from the rich material culture that we know from ancient Egypt. We have so many data from other sources. I mentioned a lot of time pottery. So we have a lot of pottery, pre-dynastic pottery that was painted, and the kind of iconography and the kind of elements were pretty much the same. So you can compare, and this pottery is found in good context, good archaeological context that you can date, and you have C14 at least sometimes, not always, but you can have, some good dating. So this is what is really helping us in Egypt. And this is quite a unique occurrence for rock art, because we know so much of the ancient Egyptian visual culture and artistic culture from other sources. Think of all the depictions in the temples or in the tombs, from different periods. So you can really go and see, the iconography, the stylistic comparative elements, and then you can come up with a good chronological time span. So sometimes we can really go, with an approximation of 100 years, which is pretty unique. So this is really something unique for Egypt, because we know so much about this, the visual culture from other sources. Otherwise, would have been, impossible to do like in any other place in the world. I mean, we will have, larger, let's say, chronological attributions.
Yes, you are very lucky with this comparative material, but it's really also very inspirational for other regions, especially the neighboring regions.
Yeah,
so one last question. You also mentioned OSL for dating. So how are you using this method?
So it was used only by Dirk Huygens for the Paleolithic rock art so far, because that was more difficult to have comparative data. So for the pre-dynastic, for instance, we have so many other comparative data that is not, let's say, strictly necessary. But for the Paleolithic, to confirm that that rock art was indeed so old, Dirk used that kind of methodology. So the OSL, you just date the sediment, particularly the sand sediment. So the quartz, part of the sand that can be dated with OSL, and so that can give you a date antequem. So you can say, okay, at least this drawing was older than this date. How much older, you don't know, of course, but then you can, that's the only way you can go. So we have started to use OSL date, generally speaking. I mean, particularly the projects working on prehistoric Egypt, so on the prehistory or geology, because of course, as I said, I mean, we have huge issues in applying scientific methodologies in Egypt. And so this one, because it's a geological methodology, it's easier to apply because the samples are geological samples and not archaeological samples, and then you can deal with them in a different way. So we are also trying to build up this kind of program to put together and see which one, let's say, of our many rock art examples can be dated, because not all of them, I mean, you have to find the right sediment, so the right context to date it. It's not so easy. It's not so easy. So Dirk was lucky with one panel only, but managed to do that, and that was really something, important, very important.
I hope we'll be able to discuss more about it but I don't want to take all the time. So if there is any other question to Maria, please go on. And if not, I would like to thank you very much. It was really fascinating, and it was a pleasure to have this broad picture of the pictures from you. So thank you very much, and I hope that in sometimes you'll be back with a presentation of also on the outcomes of the Borderscape project. We also have some things to do with rock art.
For sure, yes.
As far as I know. Okay.
Yes, yeah. Well, for sure, yeah. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you. Have a nice day.